Hi, this is Dr. Johnson, and in this video I'm going to explain the difference between primary and secondary sources, which is really important when you're teaching history, because you really have two questions as a teacher. What activities you're going to do to best help your students learn, and what materials, what sources, resources you're going to use with your students. Now, I've picked as an example this content standard from the Hawaii Social Studies Standards. Bonus point if you can tell what grade level this is. I like this one because I like the idea of studying significant people and events and how they shape our community. And for this example, I'm gonna pick the Wright brothers. I think a lot of students have experience with flight and airplanes, and for second graders, this will be a great little topic. So specifically, I'm looking at the Wright brothers' first flight, which took place in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17th, 1903. So let's see, we're going to talk about that. Here's a source of information. I'm looking at sources of information. I might use this website. This is a great website from the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian. So a website is a great source of information, and on this website it looks like I have a lot of history, a lot of pictures, just a lot of stuff there to really learn about Wilbur and Orville Wright. Or I could use this. This is a photo that was taken. This is right after takeoff, in essence, of the first successful flight. Kind of a cool photograph. I have lots of copies available out on the internet for me to download. I could use a great book. I love this book, the Fly on the Wall History Series. But this one is all about the Wright brothers' first flight. This might be an enjoyable book to read with the students or to make available in my library for them to look at. I might decide that we're going to make a little model. I might order this model off of Amazon, and we're going to run our own test flight and kind of see how the plane works, or have it available for students to touch and feel. It's a great source. I did a YouTube search, and I actually found video of the Wright brothers flying, and this is video that was shot back then and has been digitized and posted to YouTube, which was great. I also found another video from I forget what. History Made Simple, I think, is this YouTube channel. But this is a great little mini documentary about their first successful airplane flight. And I found this. This is from the U.S. Patent Office. This was a patent the Wright brothers drew and submitted in 1906 to patent their airplane and their design, which is really what made them be able to have a successful flight where they could control the airplane. So all of those sources of information would be really cool to use in my classroom, and I have to decide as a teacher, of course, which ones are the best. Now, to help me understand this, we're going to talk about primary or secondary sources. Let me give you some wordy words here. First of all, primary sources. This is any information, whether that's books, pictures, anything that we just saw, that are what we call first-hand accounts. In other words, they were created at the time the event took place. Now, they could have been created later, like maybe Orville Wright wrote a journal. He could have recorded his journal entry during the flight. I doubt he did. So maybe he sat down 5 years later, 10 years later. The Prophet Joseph Smith sat down up to, I think, 7 or 12 years later and wrote his accounts of the First Division. So primary sources can be created later. But the primary kind of definition of them is their first-hand accounts. The person was there. They're usually what we'd call original documents. And they're giving one point of view. They don't try to describe or analyze a bunch of stuff. It's just kind of one snapshot in time. Common primary sources that we find out there are these type of materials. And these are the things that get created when history happens. You know, someone takes a photograph. Someone's recording it on their cell phone. And, they're getting video. Someone writes it down in a journal, or a newspaper article writes about it. Someone's taking notes. There's all sorts of ways of getting primary sources. But remember the definition. It's a primary source when it's a first-hand account. was created at the time the events took place or later by someone who was at the event. So primary sources. So just thinking about primary sources, and of course you could pause on this screen to look at these a little bit closer. But of all my sources here, I want you to pause this video and think about which one of these are primary sources. Which one of these materials and stuff that I'm thinking about using with my students are original first-hand accounts created at the time or maybe later by someone who was at that event. So pause the video, write down what you think your answers are on a piece of paper or put post-it notes on the screen, and I'll be back with you in about 30 seconds. Pause, pause, pause. If you didn't pause, it's not 30 seconds later, it's right now. So which ones do you think are primary sources? Here comes the answers. These three. The photograph was taken at the time of the event took place. The patent took place at that time. Wright brothers did it, they were there. The movie was created at that time. Even though it's posted on YouTube, which hadn't been invented for nearly 100 years later, it is a recording of the events at that time. So these are primary sources. The others are not. Those other four that I'm thinking about using with my students are called secondary sources. They take place after the event. And they're usually what we'd call compilations. They try to analyze, interpret. They combine many primary sources together. They're trying to make sense of things. So that last one there, they're one step removed from what they're describing. That's a fancy way of saying the person wasn't there. They're trying to make sense of it based off of primary sources that they've read or looked at. So secondary sources conclude this whole list of things. And pretty much when you see any of these things on here, it could be a secondary source. Like if you ever hear encyclopedia, that's a secondary source. That's a compilation of a lot of information that's come together and someone's decided what's the most important stuff to include. A documentary film. Someone's put together a bunch of primary sources. They may even show primary sources in that documentary film. But the documentary film itself is a secondary source because someone has made a decision on what primary sources to include and how to analyze and interpret that historical event. Now notice I have newspapers here, and you also saw newspapers in the primary source list. That's because newspapers, when they take place, they're primary sources. If I'm looking at a newspaper from 1903 about the Wright brothers, and it's now 2020, for me, that 1903 newspaper is a primary source. It was written at the time. But if I'm in 1903 and I read a news report of the Wright brothers flying, most likely that news reporter wasn't there. That news reporter's probably compiled a bunch of information together. They interviewed the Wright brothers. They talked to someone who was there. They got a bunch of primary sources and then they put them together. So in that case, it could be considered a secondary source. So be careful on some of these because newspapers are primary or secondary depending on the time when you look at them and really what they're trying to explain. Now that might be a little bit confusing, but let's just take a look at our example of these sources that I might use with my kids. And you might have considered before, but do you remember which ones were secondary sources? Which one compile a bunch of primary sources together and try to analyze or interpret what actually happened? And if you're thinking right, these are the four. The website is a bunch of primary sources put together, but someone has decided what they wanted to share, and they've kind of told their version of the story based off of what they've read and what they see. A documentary is always a secondary source because someone has decided which primary sources to rely upon and is their own interpretation of what happened. Same with the book. And then this one's really kind of an interesting thing because this model here, it's not a primary source. It wasn't built by the Wright brothers. So it's kind of a secondary representation. And it kind of brings me to the point of, does this really matter? In some ways, no, not with the model airplane. But in other ways, yes. Because when I'm looking at these other three, the documentary, the book, and the website, I have to decide which one's the most accurate version of history and which one gives me the materials and the information that's best suited for my students. And all three of these might work really good, but I might find that this website maybe is too complex for second graders to read. And maybe there's a better website or other information source that my students would benefit from. So I have to be aware. I can also need to be aware of some other things, but that's covered in another video that I do on the advantages and disadvantages of primary and secondary. So remember, primary and secondary are just sources of information you can use to help meet a content standard like this one. And they're just nice to have around and to be able to understand. Now, if you're still not quite sure what primary and secondary sources are, you're still a little confused, go to Canvas, and on the Canvas website, I have a whole bunch of information about learning about primary and secondary sources. There are some great videos on there that you can look at, and I'll continually add to that as I find more. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day.